Welcome to dis&datInformation, 3 June. We're looking at Sraffa and the classicals. It's connected to there are a variety of links. One of the links has a long or 106 slide presentation that can sort out where we are today. And I've taken a few slides from that, only a couple. The point is to revisit Sraffa, as I have done a couple of times. I've come back again because this is probably the best methodological description of the difference between classical political economy and neoclassical political economy, with which we're currently stuck, as they say. And I've had conversations about those other things before. The point being is that we need to continue to rethink the heterodox project, and it has lots of variants, and it's not something that you sort of isolate and exist autonomously. Speaking of which, but I think it's important to reconsider some of the basic concepts, the basic differences, because that helps to identify where we are. Some people would insist that we're at a quote unquote new interpretation of the heterodox project. And that's one way of looking at it. Another way is to reassert the differences because as you move forward, particularly if you're in the American part of the Anglo-American context, you'll find that there's a dominant point of view that will often get you in trouble. So anyway, without further ado, this is from an article, Marx After Sraffa, an open issue, and it was done at a time when, the beginning of a kind of reemergence of reappraising the sort of path that Marxism has gone, that is problems of value, the value form, and ultimately some things that are being worked out. The question of that Marxian economics does not, political economy does not always address enough of the sort of areas, and that maybe we should ignore all microeconomic ideas and agree with Steve Keen that it is all a macro problem and always one of big data and large numbers. Well, yes and no, because I think there always is and there always will be, particularly because we sit at the intersection of many methodological problems that relate to, for example, ideology. And so that I don't think you ever eliminate issues of subjectivity as much as you might want to ignore it, and particularly radical subjectivity. Anyway, this is from that article, Sraffa After Marx, an open issue, and this sort of encompasses the whole idea. It's just one little paragraph, but it is a paragraph that is loaded with most of the issues at work. The rate of surplus value of the first volume of Capital is not erased in favor of the other definition preferred both by Sraffa and the new interpretation. It accurately depicts the macro-social outcome of the struggle over labor time, that is, labor power, between classes, and hence the division between the total living labor expended and the share which has been devoted to the reproduction of the working class. Since, however, prices of production redistribute the new value added among individual capitals in such a way that the producers of wage goods may obtain a higher or lower amount than actually produced by the labor power they employed. The gross money profit / money wage rate is a different quantitative measure, a deceptive form of appearance in circulation, obscuring the origin of surplus value from labor. Now, that's certainly the issue of the modern period, but it is a long, it's an argument from design issue that there is a certain logic And we are now struck with the kind of the differences of the class logic of capitalism. And ultimately, as we'll see this week, we're going to be looking at monopoly capitalism in a day or so on Bran and Sweezy, partially because it is a classic, but that it is in preparation for the class unity session on Sunday. But it's also important to revisit it because it does have a particular point of view and did inform certainly decades of Marxian analysis. Now, this particular one is Scott Carter's approach, Scott Carter of University of Tulsa. So this is from his slide presentation on the rehabilitation of classical political economy in the spirit of the work inspired by Piero Sraffa. Lecture 1, Production, Value, Price, Money, and Distribution in a One Commodity Model. It's purely a Sraffian thing, but the idea is here to identify some of the kinds of issues, and that Sraffa, not that he was misinformed or that he was wrong or whatever, he did raise an important point, and he was questioning this commodity. It was a refining of the problem of the commodity, and in fact, not enough work in Marx has been spent on the commodity form, mainly because, you get tied up and you go, well, I don't want to be a victim of, commodity fetishism, et cetera. And that creates a kind of negative point of view, and that often a negative framing that can cause issues when you're trying to learn this stuff. So anyway, I put in links, the link to the overall kind of project that might be, plus the PDFs. Now, first slide. The approach taken here develops the theory of value and distribution, the theory of value and distribution of classical political economy, CPE, in terms of the advances made by Piero Sraffa as discerned by the present writer, that is, Scott. The frame of reference takes a nonlinear view of the history of economic thought in the development of the history of value and distribution. The theory of value is a theory which explains the generalized exchange between heterogeneous goods in market economies. The theory of value is taken as the basis of what underlies the theory of money in the different approaches. Secondly, theory of distribution is a theory which explains the distribution of revenue from the value added of an economic system. The theory of distribution considers the mechanisms underlying the accrual of different streams of revenue to the agents in an economic system. So, two differently broadly conceived theoretical perspectives that attempt to explain generalized exchange and the distribution of income will be advanced. So, two different theoretical perspectives. One is classical political economy, CPE, and the second is neoclassical marginalist economics. It's the dominant form taught in, for example, the United States. Now, this is a huge slide, or a small slide, a brief nonlinear sketch of the history of economic thought. It doesn't quite unfold in such an even way, but I think it's important to see that the current controversy is one between modern heterodox approaches, as you can see above, a continuing line from classical political economy, and the dominant form, which includes, in the current state, modern Austrian approaches, which for some people is problematic and often adopted by people who don't know what and will never know what Austrian approaches are. And neoclassical economics is subjective marginal utility theory of value, value based in utility maximization at the margin of constrained choice. It's Marshallian. And the point of doing that, the point of, is it's just easier to teach. It's a little harder when you have more, non-marginal values. So this is the contrast, and it's a historical one, and it's an important historical one. One did come sort of after the other, but it was simply layered on top of the other. Marx did we can argue that Marx was or wasn't aware of marginal analysis towards the end of his life, but the fact is it developed sort of in parallel to him. And had he moved further, we would have seen, I think, some interesting stuff. But, of course, history intervenes. So classical political economy, 1600s to 1870. This is, the emergence of the capitalist mode of production. Theory of value based on commensurate quantities of labor time necessary to produce commodities. The primary unit of analysis is a social aggregate macro level, a social aggregate at the macro level. The agents, that is, people who do stuff, there is social actors such as classes and industries. It certainly is constructed of individuals, but let's just go with this for the moment. Secondly, the other thing that we were just looking at, neoclassical marginalist economics, the NME, 1870 to the present. And the marginalist school is an important school. It underlies, most of the kind of body in the American context of how we learn how to do business ultimately. Theory of value based on commensurate quantities of utility optimized at the margin of constrained choice. This is the idea is that you have utility curves and a utility, edges, and that it optimizes at a particular moment or point, and that otherwise things are indifferent on that curve, for example. The primary unit of analysis in NME is individual disaggregate micro level. Now, this is not to, this is the Steve Keen point in the sense that perhaps we should just ignore the individual disaggregate micro level because it has cooties or whatever. If we're thinking in a more classical way, or at least a non-neoclassical way, and it doesn't divide so easily. So please remember that as you go through this. Agents in the NME are individual actors such as consumers and firms. So you look at firm behavior, consumer behavior. It's the standard undergraduate first year, then third year, microeconomic course or whatever. What's the point? Each theoretical perspective has the task of explaining the objective problem to be solved, namely, how is it, or how it is, that different quantities of different heterogeneous things exchange for one another in non-capricious proportions which are observed in the market. So the most important idea is that it is trying to explain all this stuff in a way that is intelligible and addresses itself to both a social aggregate and ultimately a critique of the individual disaggregate level. So ultimately, it's about a bunch of things that includes behavior, includes evolution, includes logic, includes all kinds of stuff, including bargaining, for example. Now, notice that the very idea of what constitutes the economy differs from the outset. CPE, classical political economy, considers the economy as a social construction, and the unit of analysis is at the macro social level. Now, the point is that classical political economy it is not so much that it's just talking always about generalities. It is talking about particulars. It just is looking at the social construction of particulars. And yes, the unit of analysis is at a macro level, but there are micro foundations, or I will insist anyway, that there are micro foundations sitting around there somewhere that we need to sort of and it's not just for the pedagogical reasons. I think it helps explain to us what is actually going on. If you use, for example, metaphors to explain the economy, that they inevitably are either firm or sectoral, or, that it's just, you have to talk about individuals or particulars and generalities. So the value relation turns on the objective conditions of production. Commensuration is based on quantities of labor time necessary to produce a unit of a commodity. So already it went back to the micro thing. So don't, always assume that it's always going to be macro. NME considers the economy as an individual construction as opposed to a social construction. Now, the individual construction notion is problematized in a whole bunch of different ways and includes something called methodological individualism, which is problematic, and yet we do study it at various levels, and it's necessary in order to do stuff like statistics. So it is it's there. And the unit of analysis is at the micro individual level. Now, the value relation turns on the subjective conditions of utility maximization. That's the key point, the key difference, the one that Marx doesn't get to eventually historically. And some Marxists did get to it, so it's not like there was a big wall between the two, but people get, you know, troubled by this utility maximization assumption, the Marshallian sort of, and there is a whole non-Marshallian, non-linear, whole bunch of other things that are implied by the difference between CPE and NME. Commensuration in NME is based on quantities of subjective utility at the margin of constrained choice received from the consumption of a unit of a commodity. Now, that's how it's taught and how it's explained in the Marshallian context, but inevitably you have to generalize. So this is the fun there. These two are still linked in a very important way. Now, there's a video that explains this, hopefully clearer than I. Although when you look at it's got math in it. It's got math in it. So I'm not going to play it because lest you get flummoxed, but there is math. It's not hard math. And the point of doing this math is to show that they kind of look like each other. And that's the important point, is that they're, it's not that one is irrelevant because oh gosh, it talks about macro things and it's all about ideology, overgeneralization of things. And, we're doing the good stuff because we're looking at unit prices of goods. No, it actually tries to level it out. And it is worth, if you have a little math interest, to do this because it's not a bad exercise. It makes certain assumptions that are not problematic. It just shows that there's a structural similarity. So warning ahead of time. And so I introduced this to show you that there is something that Sraffa's work is being compared to. Sraffa's is an investigation of classical political economy, but trying to make it work in a more mathematically astute age, one that even at the less complicated or the more complicated of ideas, like in Keynesianism, you still have to do a little bit of that work. And understanding the difference between CPE and NME helps you, I would like to think, helps you when negotiate those kinds of things, particularly when you want to talk about policy. So I've added an article and I'll read it through. It will get dense at times. I'm going to skip some of the math, so don't freak out. Sraffa's constructive and interpretive work and Marx. Christian Gerke and Heinz Kurtz. Abstract. This article provides a summary account of Pierre Sraffa's constructive and interpretive work on the classical approach to the theory of value and distribution and its relationship with Marx's contributions. It is shown that in the early phase of his constructive work, Sraffa developed his equation systems, don't freak out, by adopting a physical real cost approach and a strictly objectivist point of view. You'll hear the argument of a physicalist approach, and that's what that refers to, and completely eschewed Marx's labor-based approach and the related Marxian concepts. In fact, many people just simply have to, that's the shibboleth. You have to sort of be versed in two languages or two codes, and never the twain shall meet. Well, the reality is that they do meet, and Sraffa is part of that, trying to work through that in order to not to resuscitate Marx, but to give Marx a real place. And in fact, when Sraffa is writing this is the moment at which, with all due respect, Marxism in the form of the Russian Soviet economy is trying to work fully at the moment of doing a whole economy using Marxian concepts. So only at a later stage did he explore systematically the relation between his own modern reformulation of the surplus approach to the theory of value, surplus value, and distribution. Theory of value and distribution. Remember, the theory of value and the theory of distribution are brought together in useful and important ways. It's always there. And um, a lot of people in NME will say, well, value irrelevant, subjective, random, even. Yes and no. And I think the history of the capitalist economy proves that, so that there is value does operate. It's just harder to get a handle on. And Marx's contribution he considered Marx's most important analytic contribution to the further development of the surplus approach to consist of the reintegration of what we've been looking at before, circular production relations, which as opposed to circular distribution relations, which allowed him to see the existence of a maximum rate of profits and its role in an analysis of accumulation and technical change. So his goal was the same. It's the same as the Marxian thing. You know, we're looking at, what do profits look like? And how do we see profits in analyzing accumulation, whether it's primitive or original accumulation, and the question of transformation, that is technical change. So it is um, relevant then as it is now, a century later. We need to sort of understand the value and distribution issues of, for example, digital currency and a variety of other things. And I'd like to think that looking at the classical model will allow us not a revisionist point of view, but work through some of the areas that, the NME approach does have a system of assumptions that tend, in a methodological way, to limit its viability as a solution to greater problems of inequity and value and distribution in more extreme sorts of ways. The goal, and this is an oversimplication as well, that the CPE had a belief in capitalism and accumulation, certainly. NME simply makes that more explicit at the maximizing level, as opposed to the value and distribution ideas that we're not completely indifferent when we enter a market. We do have, you don't shut off your preferences, they're there, and to acknowledge that they're there is really important. And one can assert, even if you use, NME does, it's supposed to be there. It's a token thing in the curriculum so that you can understand marketing, for example, and need to sort of work through that. The publication of Sraffa's Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities has been a landmark in the appraisal. It was published in 1960, has been a landmark in the appraisal of Marx's contributions to economic theory. Sraffa demonstrated that relative prices and the rate of profits are fully determined in terms of the technical conditions of production and the real wage rate. That is, the objective data underlying the approach of the classical economists and Marx, including Marx. Labor values are derived magnitudes providing no additional information and are therefore redundant. With the opening of Sraffa's papers in the Wren Library at Trinity College, Cambridge, it has become possible to study in detail, if you read Italian, the development of his interpretive and constructive work, culminating in the production of commodities by means of commodities, that is, PCMC. The picture that emerges from Sraffa's paper, and there are some unpublished papers that are part of this sort of restudying Sraffa's work. The picture that emerges from Sraffa's papers with regard to the relationship of his own work to Marx's contribution to economic theory turns out to be both clear and straightforward, and more complicated than might have been expected. And I think that you can sort of expect that idea that it is more complicated. It is more complex, perhaps. But there are contemporary economists after Sraffa who have kind of worked out some of these problems because they went in and figured out some of the math stuff, and also have helped us organize certain concepts about production. So, Sraffa clearly regarded Marx as, number one, an author who had rediscovered the surplus approach to the theory of value and distribution, had reconstructed its analytic structure and historical development, and sought to elaborate on it. And number two, an economic theorist, Sraffa clearly regarded Marx as, number two, an economic theorist, firmly rooted in the surplus approach tradition, who had made important analytic contributions to its further development, thus carrying it beyond the state in which it had been left by Ricardo. At the same time, however, the picture is also more complicated because of the beginning of his interpretive and constructive work, which can be dated to the second half of 1927. Sraffa considered it, and note that 1927 is, interesting year relative to the history of communism, for example, the death of Lenin, the rise of Stalin, etc., the failure of the problems with the NEP, the new economic, program, etc., etc. Sraffa considered it necessary to put Marx's and Ricardo's labor-based approach to the theory of value and distribution to one side and to work out his systems of equations by elaborating on the physical real cost approach which he had encountered in the precursors to this business, in particular William Petty and the French physiocrats. During the entire first period of his constructive work, which extended roughly from the second half of 1927 to the end of 1931, note that this comes during, the crash, the depression, lots of stuff going on. And, some people are kind of impelled to sort of look for solutions. Sraffa completely eschewed Marx's labor-based reasoning and concepts, and for quite some time, in fact, well into 1929, he was convinced that labor must not enter as a quantity at all into that is Sraffa's production equations. It is only at the beginning of the 1940s, and then more intensely during the second period of his constructive work, extending mainly from 1942 to 46, and that's interesting also in the context of, for example, the Frankfurt School, that the more interesting work, in fact, comes during the war period, that one encounters clear expressions of a change in Sraffa's critical attitude towards the labor theory of value and in his critical assessment of the usefulness of Marx's labor-based concepts. Now, the reason for this was that he saw that Marx had recaptured the circularity aspect of social production, volume 3 and volume 2, which had to some extent got lost in Smith and Ricardo, and had been struggling with problems similar to those he himself was addressing, and how Marx had tried to cope with them in terms of his labor-based reasoning. And, that's the fundamental argument about, there is a classical political economy. Marx does a critique of classical political economy, but retains, obviously, because it is a critique, certain elements of Smith and Ricardo. And other people would say, well, you should have jettisoned, certain assumptions. And with respect to, sort of examining Marx's writing, he does actually. He eventually kind of moves away from that to something more, we can both say, scientific and evolutionary at the same time. And it's there. I mean, it's there in, the discussion of social ecology is perhaps the best example of showing that Marxism and social ecology are the best way of explicating what Marx was dealing with in the latter part of his life, following the publication of Volume 1 of Capital. In our reading, Sraffa's appreciation of Marx's achievements developed in close relation to his own constructive work and was undergoing considerable change over time. Hence, in the following sections of this article, we provide a brief reconstruction of the development of Sraffa's thought, with particular emphasis on its relation to his appraisal of Marx's contributions. And, let me break here for a second and say, this is a fundamental issue. Some people, tend to pick a side. That is, are you a neo-Ricardian? Or, are you a fellow traveler? Why haven't you jettisoned Ricardianism, or et cetera, and it gets a little murky and problematic. And so getting a better handle on this is really important from a scholarly point of view, but also I think in understanding that, Sraffa is not in this particular situation, or neo-Ricardians in general are not trashing the class struggle, et cetera, all of that literature. It is simply looking at an analytic model that provides the means by which we can move forward in a, historical, materialistic way, and yet acknowledge that empirical matters. Physical real cost and simultaneous equations is the second section here. Sraffa's work on the reconstruction and modern reformulation of the classical approach to the theory of value and distribution emanated from notes that he composed in the summer of 1927 in preparation for his lectures on advanced theory of value, which he was supposed to give at Cambridge University, beginning in October, but which were then postponed for a year and held from 1928 to 31. As early as the end of 1927, Sraffa, in one of his notes, referred to mia theoria, and the libro he intended to write. Sraffa's papers show that the years from 1927 to 1931 were the period in which he laid the foundations of his book, the 1960 book. It was then that he saw the distinctive character. This implies also that we do not share the interpretation of Marx's role in the development of Sraffa's thought suggested by De Vivo in 2003 and Gilbert also in that year, according to whom Marx's schemes of simple reproduction in Volume 2 of Capital were the source of Sraffa's equation. That may be overstating it. These interpretations have been shown to be lacking in textual evidence and had to be contradicted by what Sraffa actually wrote. And so the literature divides there, that is, De Vivo and Gilbert, and Kurtz and Salvadori. And that is actually the major difference between this kind of writing. There's a whole thing that tries to make it all work. And then there's a whole bunch of people say, well, no, there's no connection. And you need to sort of, think of this in a more neo sort of way. And that's oversimplifying it as well. The following summary accounts of the development of Sraffa's thought draws heavily on some of our earlier work, alone or together, and in collaboration with Neri Salvadori, or in particular in Kurtz, Gerke and Kurtz and Salvadori, as well as etc. With the publication in the MIGA, that is the Marx archives, edition of the manuscripts that Marx composed for volumes 2 and 3 of Capital, it has become possible to study in detail the textual differences between Marx's original manuscripts and Engels' edition. As I've mentioned far too many times before, Engels goes back and edits stuff for all kinds of good reasons. But, stuff happens and it gets messed up for a variety of reasons, and probably from either negligence or inaction or other kinds of even academic reasons. There's issues, which we can talk about at another time. While this will not be a main object in this article's discussion, we shall take the opportunity to point out some instances in which Engels presented Marx's argument in a modified, if not distorted way, of the standpoint of old classical economists in the theory of value and distribution. The theory of value and distribution, that's a fundamental thing that we're looking at here. And it became clear to him that it was not just an early and somewhat crude version of Marshall's theory, and that's a whole argument as well. Presuming that, yes, by the time he starts talking about things that actually, when he does all these little mathematical exercises, it would have been helped if he had kind of had an idea about, sort of utility approach. But that's, being kind of a counterfactualist. But anyway, Sraffa was impressed by the classical author's explanation of all incomes other than wages in strictly objective terms on the basis of the social surplus product that obtains after all means of production and all means of subsistence in support of workers had been deducted from given outputs. This is what Marx says, that according to Sraffa, this method had found a particularly clear expression in a passage in Petty's Political Arithmetic, in which Petty advocated the physician's outlook, which implied expressing himself exclusively in only such causes and as have visible foundations in nature. leaving those that depend upon the mutable minds, opinions, appetites, and passions of particular men to the consideration of others' subjectivity. Petty's physicalist or natural science point of view, which explicitly eschews subjectivist notions, um, uh, Sraffa also encountered in other uh, classical authors. Even more physicalist in character is Mill's dictum, quote, the agents of production are the commodities themselves. They're the food of the laborer, the tools and machines with which he works, and the raw materials which he works upon. Sraffa, in the early period, fully endorsed the objectivist methodology advocated by Petty, which he regarded also to be in accordance with the methodological imperatives of modern science, as can be seen from his annotations in and excerpts from contemporary books on modern physics by Planck, Heisenberg, and others. And that's the point that Bellamy Foster makes in comparing Engels' writing with social ecology. Against Marshall's concept of real cost, which referred to magnitudes that are not directly observable and not measurable, Sraffa therefore put that of physical real costs put that of physical real cost. Marshall had conceived of the real cost of a commodity as the exertions of all the different kinds of labor that are directly and indirectly involved in making it, together with the abstinences, or rather the writings required for saving the capital used in making it. That's a point about capitalism, that capitalism has built into it a kind of accumulative austere, if you will, tendency that morally rationalizes certain other accumulative spirits, as it were. While Petty and the physiocrats focused on the commodities actually consumed or destroyed in the production of some other commodities, that is, on physical amounts of things, the notion of real cost, introduced by Marshall, invoked disutility, pain, and abstinence experienced by agents. That is, psychic elements. Scarcity is a psychic element, if you will. Sraffa firmly rejected Marshall's subjectivist notion of real cost and stressed the sort of costs which determine values is the collection of material things used up in production. As to labor, Sraffa sided with Petty, who had insisted that what matters are the means of subsistence in support of the workers. For short, bread or food, not labor. Now, labor is in fact an abstraction. By the time Marx gets hold of it, it has become an abstraction like labor power. All right. So and then there are notes in here, but this theory coincides with the labor theory of cost. In effect, we cannot measure for lack of common unit goods which are in the cost, but ultimately, if we go back far enough, all goods come to labor. And if we want to go behind labor, we find the goods commanded by laborers. If we want to measure them, the only unit is quantity of goods necessary to support a laborer for one day. This is roughly constant, and therefore we can take an hour of ordinary labor as a unit. From November 1927, Sraffa began to elaborate his equations of production, first for a system without a surplus, that is, this is the so-called first equations, and then for one with a surplus, second equations. For example, in a document composed in the winter of 1927 to 28, Sraffa stated, that is, with no surplus, A equals A1, B1, C1, etc., A, B, C equations, where A is the big A equals the sum of small a, big B, capital B is the sum of all the other little b's, and C, etc. These are homogeneous linear equations. They have infinite sets of solutions, but the solutions of each set are proportional. These proportions are unique, univoce. These proportions we call ratios of absolute values. This is a little dense, so don't worry about this. They are purely numerical relations between the things A and B, that is capital A, capital B. They're not necessarily the ratios in which exchange will actually take place in any community in which the quantities of things respectively used in production, that is consumed and produced satisfy these equations, and such actual ratios of exchange are also conditioned by such things as legal institutions, etc., which vary in different organizations of society and which are quote unquote arbitrary, i.e., irrelevant from our present point of view. There and as I have said before in lecture, arbitrary is not identical to random. Sraffa apparently interpreted these equalities in two ways. First, he saw them as the tabulation of production processes with A, Big B, and Big C as gross outputs of three commodities, and AI, BI, and CI, this in lowercase, as the amounts of the three commodities used up in the production of the respective gross outputs, I equals 1, 2, or 3. And this other little note here, and don't get crazy. From the end of November 1927, Sraffa also wrote down equations with a surplus in which A is greater than or less than the sum of all little a's, similarly for B and C. And at least one inequality is a strong one. Now, these he called his second equations, which can be seen as a direct extension of the first equations. Now, second, he appears to have interpreted them as equations, although there are no unknowns for which a unique solution except for a proportionality factor could be found. Yet, in the following months, he wrote down systems of his first equations in which he explicitly used two letters for each quantity, one expressing the amount of units of the commodity and the other its value or price. Now, this is where, you begin to substitute value and price and get confused in many ways. So one should just simply, hold this value price problem in abeyance for the moment. As Sraffa stressed, the important result of his inquiry was that relative prices are fully determined by solving a set of simultaneous equations in which only objective data describing the social production process mattered as proximate determinants. It's got to be in the real world, and it's got to, you can count it. Sraffa swiftly also saw that, in the case of his first equations, it was possible to reduce the value of a commodity to the amounts of some other commodity needed directly and indirectly in its production. Let me break here and say that, obviously some other commodity needed directly and indirectly in its production is a new way of thinking about it. It is not simply the things that you use in the production process itself, but that there are other things that are, in a supply chain or in a, you got a tool and you need to assemble the tool or whatever, or get a better tool, and that's the, a transformational problem. Therefore, now back to the text. Therefore, the exchange ratios of any two commodities may be conceived as reflecting the relative amounts of any one of the commodities in the system used up directly and indirectly in the production of one unit of the two commodities under consideration. It thus became obvious to him that once the problem was approached from a rigorous physical real cost point of view, that is, the thing is there and you got to account for it, the notion of a common measure loses much of the appeal that it had in the earlier authors, including Marx. And yes, there's a whole bunch of math that goes on. Frank Ramsey is also in here fiddling around, and it would be useful ultimately to read some Frank Ramsey at the same time, because what Frank Ramsey is interested in is very useful for us in a social ecology sense. Let me just say that as a kind of extension. For example, you could argue that congestion pricing in the New York case has, has some things that we might attribute to, or at least have an effect by Frank Ramsey. So anyway, number three, Sraffa's critical stance towards the labor theory of value. From scrutinizing the contributions of the earlier classical authors, most notably Petit, Cantillon, and Quesnay, or Quesnay, Sraffa concluded that the adoption of the labor theory of value by the later writers had involved a corruption of the surplus approach. In a note entitled Degeneration of Cost and Value, probably written in November 1927, he insisted, A. Smith and Ricardo and Marx indeed began to corrupt the old idea of cost, that is, from food to labor, but their notion was still near enough to be in many cases equivalent. So, it's fuzzy. He expounded the fatal error of Smith, Ricardo, Marx has been to regard labor as a quantity to be measured in hours or in kilowatts of human energy and thus commensurate to value. And remember, this idea of commensurate is through this entire work. And ultimately, when you compare incommensurate and commensurate things, these become really important fundamental ideas. But anyway, that's for another time. All trouble seems to have been caused by small initial errors which have accumulated in deductions. That is, for example, the food of the worker equals the quantity of labor is nearly true. You know, a caloric, consumption per day, etc. Petty had foreseen the possibility of being misunderstood. Similarly, whatever, this is the from Sraffa. In his early phase, which extended well into 1929, Sraffa was strictly opposed to employing the concept of labor as a quantity in his equations. In an illuminating document stemming from November 1927, he insisted it is the whole process of production that must be called human labor and thus causes all product and all value. Marx and Ricardo used labor in two different senses. The above version and that of one of the factors of production, that is, hours of labor or quantity of labor, has a meaning only in the latter sense, that is, quantity of labor, not hours of labor. It is by confusing these two senses that they got mixed up and said that value is proportional to quantity of labor in the second sense, whereas they ought to have said that it is due to human labor in the first sense, a non-measurable quantity, or rather not a quantity at all. So here you have the entire crux of the problem, is whether you treat it as measurable or not measurable, as something verging toward quality and not quantity ever or at all. And so this is the crux of the problem of labor theory of value, is to go from labor, because labor does exist, to something more focused, that is, this idea of labor power, which has more to do with other matters that, yes, that may seem subjective, but you can see that there's quantitative stuff going on. So, for example, there's a whole, area of study that talks about attention, and to make it even more ugly, audience attention. And, can you quantify attention? And yet you shouldn't, or you can't, and yet it's really important because you're kind of messing with some things that actually have quantifiable elements. So there's still fuzziness, even in the current sense. And then you can extend from that, problems of identity politics and a whole bunch of other fuzzy things. Anyway, according to Sraffa, Petty and the physiocrats not only had the right notion of cost, but they also advocated a view of production that was congenial to modern industrial societies. This is late, 18th century and into the 19th century. They envisaged production as a circular flow rather than, as in the case of the Austrian view of production, prominently advocated by Eugen von Bawerk, as a one-way avenue leading from the services of original factors of production via finite number of stages to consumption goods. This is it's over linearized in that sense, that it's just simple causality in one direction, where there's a lot of things going on. There's feedback, there's information, there's innovation, all kinds of stuff going on. However, as Sraffa noted, when commodities are produced by commodities, that is, things that gain this, a market occurs for, your hammer. I mean, you have a hammer, but, if it breaks for some odd reason, you got to go out and buy another hammer. Anyway, the idea that the process of production has a beginning and an end must be replaced with that it is a circular one, an idea first introduced by the tableau économique, Quenet. Sraffa paid tribute to Francois Quenet's ingenious analytical expression of the circular flow idea in terms of his tableau économique by equating his equations with it. Now, Marx does that too in volume in volume 2 of Capital. So, the connections are already there. It's not like, we made this up. Why then have the classical economists and Marx failed to elaborate a consistent theory of value and distribution on the basis of, number one, production viewed as a circular flow, and number two, the twin concepts of physical real costs and social surplus? Twin concepts. In Sraffa's view, the main reason derived from a mismatch between the analytical concepts and the mathematical tools at their disposal. So ultimately, it's still a math thing. And Marx is trying to work through this, and it wasn't like he gave up on this stuff. And Marx was really interested in some of that, up to the point of, trying to work through problems in calculus. And as we many have noted, ultimately would have gotten to marginal utility analysis, and whether he would have or wouldn't have accepted certain notions, is left up to speculation. More specifically, as Sraffa had demonstrated with his first equations and second equations, the tool needed to bring to fruition both conceptual elements, that is, one, production viewed as a circular flow, and number two, the twin concepts of physical real costs and social surplus, were simultaneous equations, and the knowledge of what their properties are and how to solve them. As Sraffa stressed in a document written in all probability in late 1927 or early 1928, the role of physical real costs in determining value is seen only in general equilibrium. The indispensable tool, simultaneous equations, alas, was not at the disposal of the classical authors. And now, simultaneous equations were there in the world of math. It's just that the classical authors, just didn't engage it for all kinds of reasons. And Marx, who therefore tried to solve the problems in a roundabout way, that's all the adding and subtracting and all those things in volume 2, typically by first identifying some ultimate measure of value by means of which heterogeneous commodities were meant to be rendered homogeneous. Several authors, including Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, had taken labor to be the sought standard and therefore arrived at some version of the labor theory of value. Yes, all three have a labor theory of value, and Marx is, in his critique, is saying that, well, there's kind of things, and we're sort of going to accept this for a while until we move on. And Marx did move on, as you can see in the path from volume 1 of Capital to volume 3 and beyond. However, the route via labor values was not really a way out of the impasse. Commodities are produced by means of commodities. You got to go buy tools somewhere, right? And therefore, the quantities of labor embodied in them cannot be determined, because it just gets crazy, right? There's all these different components, even of it in a good hammer, except in special cases other than from simultaneous equations. Now, that's not to compare math with a hammer, but the idea that it is a much more complicated, not necessarily complex, but complicated set of things that are going on, particularly when you place it in a real context in terms of history. I mean, you could even examine it in this particular case in the sense that Smith, Ricardo, and Marx do not quite get to simultaneous equations. And, not that simultaneous equations is the answer, but that Sraffa chose because, he was hanging around people who kind of showed how in a simultaneous equation context you can actually get stuff to work. And it's no different in that context than what the NME, that is, the other side, was working on. Right at the beginning of the Histoire, Marx took issue with Petty, who had singled out food, not labor, as the measure of value. That's actually kind of interesting. In the margin, Sraffa placed a wrinkled line along the passage in which Marx contended that any such physical input n'est pas la mesure immanente des valeurs. Marx against physical costs, Sraffa notes at this, etc. Let me read the notes here. At this time, Sraffa did not relate his equations to Marx's schemes of reproduction in volume 2 of Capital. Only in the early 1940s God, this took another decade. Did he note the family resemblance between Marx's schemes of simple reproduction and his first equations? That's actually an important point, as I've tried to point out. Um, in January 28th, there's in Sraffa's Cambridge Pocket Diary a reference to volume 2 of Wilfred Pareto's the Les Systèmes Socialistes, where he stresses the necessity of determining relative prices in terms of simultaneous equations and criticizes the older economists who did not have this tool, this hammer, at their disposal for trying to simplify matters by taking a sufficiently large number of the variables under consideration as known magnitudes. So, as Sraffa noted, in the second period of his constructive work, in special circumstances, the quantity of labor embodied can be seen at a glance. This is the case in Marx's scheme of simple reproduction, for example, where the quantity of labor employed in both departments, remember we talked about Department 1 and Department 2, Department 1 producing means of production and Department 2 means of consumption, is equal to the labor value of the net product consisting only of consumption goods. Marx's scheme can be said to foreshadow the concept of subsystem or vertically integrated sector. So there's a whole, interpretive element here that allows us, as we will see, to identify problems or the problems created by monopoly capital. And we'll talk about that tomorrow. Tertium comparationis 3.1. Sraffa variously contemplated the problem of the common third. That is, the problem, and this is a relational question as well, that is, the problem of whether qualitatively different commodities could be said to represent equal or different quantities of the same substance. Now, by discussing this statement in a famous fragment of Heraclitus, quoted by Marx in Volume 1 of Capital, whose English translation reads, quote, all things are exchanged for fire, and fire for all things as goods for gold and gold for goods. In a note written in the Lent term of 1928, Sraffa suggested that electricity might be substituted for fire as the common third or substance. This is really an important idea. I mean, this just to say, oh, okay, this is where the physics comes in. This is why, all this science, quote unquote, scientific cogitating is actually worthwhile. A possible explanation for this suggestion is that in modern times, electricity is an input in each and every commodity. You got to run your machines with something. And that in particular circumstances, there may be exchange ratios of commodities that are proportional to the relative overall amounts of electricity embodied in the various commodities. That's sort of an interesting way to think about it. And note, yes, there are other authors that talk about this problem, and we've looked at them in terms of the history of science. Or perhaps Sraffa's reference to electricity derived from his readings of some contemporary books on modern physics, Max Planck and the universe in the light of modern physics stated, if we compare the old theory with the new, we find that the process of tracing back all qualitative distinctions to quantitative distinctions has been advanced very considerably. According to the modern view, there are no more than two ultimate substances, namely positive and negative electricity. Interestingly, in his personal copy of the book, Sraffa had annotated those statements. Number 3.2, doing away with human energy. And you can see how this is this thinking. It because of the original problem of thinking, that thinking about human labor is complicated. It's hard to quantify. Doing away with human energy. Another objection to the labor theory of value may also be related to Sraffa's reading of books devoted to the natural sciences and methodological issues. For example, he carefully studied and annotated Poincaré's La Science et l'hypothèse, especially the chapter energy and thermodynamics. And from these and annotations in other books, we may infer that he believed economists must not ignore the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology. According to Sraffa, this request spoke in favor of the physical real cost approach and against the labor-based approach. The difference between the physical real costs and the Ricardo/Marxian theory of labor costs is that the first does and the latter does not include in them the natural resources that are used up in the course of production, such as coal, iron, exhaustion of land, air, water are not used up, as there is an unlimited supply. Haha, no subtraction can be made from infinity. Yes, well, yes. This is fundamental because it does away with human energy and such metaphysical things. 3.3, a purely mystical conception. Closely related to the above is Sraffa's opposition to the view typically held by advocates of the labor theory of value, according to which the wage labor of human beings must be singled out, to the exclusion of other kinds of labor when dealing with the problems of value. As Sraffa noted, this view was not restricted to such authors as Ricardo and Marx, but was encountered also in Edgeworth or Marshall. Remember, I talked about Marshallian stuff. Edgeworth has another thing that helps Marshallian math and helps us do microeconomic stuff. In fact, a keynote of Marshall's principles of economics was that free human beings are not brought up to their work on the same principles as a machine, a horse, or a slave. Now, Sraffa objected in a note composed between May and July 1928. There appears to be no objective difference between the labor of a wage earner and that of a slave and a horse, of a horse and a machine. It is a purely mystical conception that attributes to human labor a special gift of determining value. Does the capitalist entrepreneur, who is the real subject of valuation and exchange, make a great difference whether he employs men or animals? Does the slave owner? And note that in a footnote in Capital, I think it's volume 1, and the comparison in the footnote of women to horses is sort of an interesting thing. Now, Marx doesn't say that they are. He just notes that it's pretty weird that that's how we get horsepower, et cetera, et cetera. Sraffa did not agree with the criticism. In his own index of the volume, he stressed spagliata critica contra McCulloch, mistaken criticism of McCulloch. He also noted Smith appelle un bœuf un ouvrier productif. Smith calls an ox a productive worker, which Sraffa considered to be the correct view and a remnant of the earlier physical real cost approach in Smith's Wealth of Nations. 3.4, the historical labor theory of value. Sraffa also reconsidered the view which had been put forward by several authors, including Smith, McCulloch, Torrens, and Engels, that the labor theory of value holds in primitive societies. This is the primitive accumulation versus capitalist accumulation. Remember that we've been trying to revise the notion of primitive to original, which lightens up that kind of idea as opposed to making a division between civilized and uncivilized, or savages, or barbarism, or whatever. At the end of the 1920s, he consulted contemporary contributions to economic history, anthropology, and ethnology, and annotated inter alia passages dealing with the historical interpretations of the theory. In Bucher, horse winning, Sraffa read that labor among primitive peoples is something very ill-defined. Quote, in India, waiting is a rule. That, quote, time is immaterial where price is concerned, unquote, and that not labor-saving but material-saving devices of modern industry have the greatest vogue in China. He also excerpted from Firth, 1929, and noted that Hoyt, 1926, provides striking examples of a failure to accord value to time and labor, even when exchange is well developed, as did Marx. All this confirms Sraffa's view that what mattered for the determination of commodity values were physical, real costs. Number 4, third equation includes the concept of wages as a share. This idea that the wage is a kind of share, of capital, right? On the basis of his first and second equations, Sraffa had shown that if the physical real cost approach of the classical authors is developed coherently, there is no such problem as the transformation of values into prices of production. This is the whole fundamental issue. So many decades have spent on this problem. in with which Marx had struggled in vain. This does not mean that one cannot get, in certain cases, from labor values to production prices in a logically consistent way. It only means that the latter, that is, production prices, can be determined entirely independently of the former, which are therefore redundant in the analysis. Noting that this is an important point, is that it's not you're eradicating labor values, you're just simply making a proxy or an index for them using production prices. And this move seems so horrible for some people because, are you diminishing the value and the honor of labor, blah, blah, blah. Interestingly, in non-trivial cases with which one can go from labor values to price of production, the use of Sraffa's standard commodity is required. See, Sraffa goes through this cogitation and says, well, I don't want to spend too much ink on this. Let's just assume. And yes, this is the same methodological problem that is applied to NME as opposed to CPE, and that is that over standardizing or over reduction of certain ideas can be problematic. Holding certain things constant, in other words. However, before we can discuss this, we must first take note of some further steps in the development of Sraffa's constructive work. Now, while in his first and second equations, Sraffa assumed wages to be given as an inventory of commodities, he shortly afterwards began to investigate for a given system of production how a hypothetical change in wages affected the rate of profits and relative prices. So he's looking at, oh, okay, well, we've got to start looking at variables and see that wages can change, and of course there's a real problem relative to inflation, et cetera, and the current issues that wages diverge from whatever in the current climate. In this regard, he once again followed Ricardo, who investigated the implications of the workers' participation in the sharing out of the surplus product. And lest you think that's unimportant, there's whole literatures on this idea of trying to share with some kind of thing, with some kind of proxy to redistribute, surplus to the workers. And had thus arrived at his fundamental proposition on distribution, according to which the rate of profit is inversely related to proportional wages, that is, to the share of wages in the social product. Adopting Ricardo's share concept of wages forced Sraffa not only to dispense with the concept of given real, that is, commodity wages, but also to reconsider his earlier view that there's no good reason for attributing a specific role to human labor because there was no objective difference between the labor of a slave, a horse, a worker, or a machine. See, that's you can see where the problem is. Sraffa now pointed out that while the amount of fodder given to a horse, for instance, is decided by its owner exclusively on grounds of economy, the level of wages paid to workers is the outcome of a bargaining process between capitalists and workers. Well, yes and no. In a manuscript written in 1942, Sraffa expounded that in his first and second equations, the food and sustenance of the workers are treated on the same footing as that of horses. Significantly, he added, men, however, and in this they are distinguished from horses' kick. This implied that wage labor could no longer be treated on a par with other kinds of labor in terms of the physical real costs it involved, but had to be taken explicitly, as opposed to implicitly, into account. Since wages were typically paid to workers in relation to the work performed, Sraffa eventually convinced himself that human labor had to be treated as a measurable quantity. While soundings of doubt concerning his earlier view can be traced back to the summer of 1929, it was only from 1931 onward, that he began to assume that wages were paid in relation to the labor performed, and we encounter equations in which the labor employed in industry is L sub I is explicitly given. Sraffa at first does not appear to have been aware that with wages absorbing the entire surplus product, relative prices can be shown to be proportional to the relative quantities of labor embodied in the various commodities, provided relative wage rates are taken to reduce different kinds of concrete labor to some kind of simple or social labor. Well, he hasn't even gotten to the money question yet. Money as a commodity. Labor values thus simply reflect a very simple constellation of the sharing out of the surplus product among workers and capitalists. Now, very special constellation. Now, that can mean all kinds of stuff. To emphasize this fact, Sraffa in the early 1940s coined the term value theory of labor, not labor theory of value, but value theory of labor. Labor values, far from being simply observable, require the solution of a system of simultaneous equations, which must, in addition, be associated with a particular distributional constellation, this special constellation. With workers participating in the sharing out of the surplus, another classical concept lost much of its former appeal, that of ante factum, that is, before rather than after the fact payment of wages, which implied reckoning wages as belonging to the capital advanced at the beginning of the uniform period of production. Marx comments on this, it makes some comments on this about, the Germans, they don't adjust wages relative to promotion or advancement or whatever. They get you to sign a contract that you're going to work for just this amount and it's never going to alter or whatever. Now he's commenting on the 19th century, so it's not quite the same way, but you could say, and without getting into a big thing on it, that piecework resembles that, and yes, we can talk about that. Ricardo and Marx had retained this assumption, but it sat uncomfortably with the rest of their analyses. While Sraffa at first followed them towards the end of 1943, after careful deliberation, he decided to take wages to be entirely paid out of the product. This prompted him to reconsider the classical distinction between necessaries and luxuries, and to elaborate the more technical distinction between basic and non-basic products. When rereading some of Marx's works in the early 1940s, Marx found that the latter had spotted a serious flaw in Ricardo's argument. Marx approved of Ricardo's new concept of proportional wages and had translated it into his own concept of rate of surplus value, big S over big V, cap S over V, with S as the labor value of the net social surplus, that is profits, and V as the social variable capital, that is wages. Now, Ricardo had assumed that his fundamental proposition on distribution applied not only to a given system of production and use, but also to technologically changing systems. Now, against this, Marx had objected that Ricardo had erroneously identified the rate of profits with the rate of surplus value and thus overlooked the second determinant of the former. That is, the technical conditions of production as they are reflected in the organic composition of the capital of the system as a whole. And yes, decades and ink have been spent on this, down this path. Ricardo's blunder was due to the simplifying assumption he typically entertained in much of his observations on the wage-profit relationship. Namely, that capital consists entirely of or can be resolved entirely into wages. Now, the implication of this assumption is that when wages vanish, the rate of profits goes to infinity. Yet in a circular system of production, this is just not the case. However far back one carries the reduction of prices to dated quantities of labor and thus wages, there is always a commodity residue left. This is the problem of NME, is that, some things are not, that there is a real world out there. Now, for this reason, there's a finite maximum rate of profits corresponding to zero wages. And so some people, particularly people trained in math, will, use this as a knock against economics, but that's a whole nother thing. Therefore, the rate of profits can fall or rise even if proportional wages remain constant, and remain constant even if proportional wages change. Now, this becomes clear when we turn to Marx's expression for the rate of profits. And yes, there's all kinds of things in there, and we can skip that for the moment because we're almost to the end. In a manuscript written in 1943, Sraffa criticized von Berkowitz, who had objected to Marx's law of the tendency of the rate of profits to fall, the LTRPF. Yeah, there's a whole literature for this, pointing out inter alia that von Berkowitz had followed Ricardo in assuming unidirectional, remember we talked about that unidirectional problem, or linear production processes, and thereby missed the importance of the maximum rate of profits. Now, it doesn't mean, however, that Sraffa fully endorsed Marx's argument or considered the LTRPF to be generally valid. It had not escaped his attention, Sraffa's attention, that Marx's statement on the law was marred by some inconsistencies, and that Marx had himself drawn attention to various counteracting tendencies that could extenuate or even reverse the fall of the rate of profits. Interestingly, Annotations in his working copy of Volume 3 of Capital indicate that Sraffa appears to have entertained doubts about the exposition of the LTRPF being true to the original, and he even seems to have made attempts to study Marx's original manuscripts at the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam in order to compare them with the text published by Engels after Marx's death. So you can see that even Sraffa had kind of questions here about, that well, yeah, there's going to be a tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and therefore crises, and therefore, this is the vulgar sense, therefore revolution, therefore, whatever. All those things are a good idea, but in reality, that doesn't quite work out that way. As the MEGA too, this is MEGA as opposed to the MECW, whatever, the Marx Engels collected works edition shows, Engels' editorial interventions and additions indeed made the statement of the law appear more firm and definitive than seems justified in view of Marx's original text. Focusing attention on the case of a given system of production and use, Sraffa, in his book, credited Marx with having seen that, in a circular flow framework, the maximum rate of profits corresponding to zero wages is finite, not infinite. This is a very important assumption. Anyway, and 4.1, not quite to the end. Perhaps I will finish the rest. Well, no, we're almost to the end. Let's just get down to it. I think I'll be able to finish this and let you escape from the hypothesis to the standard commodity. When in the late 1920s, Sraffa began to study the dependence of the rate of profit on wages, he had to face the problem that with a change in wages, relative prices also change. The existence of these price changes made it difficult to ascertain how a given change in wages affected the rate of profits, which relates to the part of the surplus product going to capital owners. So you could say, and let me break here for a second and say, one of the ideas here is that, that there's some idea of clearing that even in Marx's context, that there's always going to be slop, and it gets worse or better relative to scale of production. So these issues of micro-macro issues are at work, even though we'd like to make it cleaner in a mathematical sense. In a document composed in the first half of 1931, Sraffa contemplated the special case in which a change in distribution has no effect on the value of the social capital or aggregate of the means of production employed relative to that of the social product, or the totality of the goods produced. It may be said that the value of total capital in terms of total goods produced cannot vary as a consequence of the variation of wages and a contrary variation of profits, since the goods are composed in exactly the same proportions as the capitals which have produced them. Now, that's an assumption that is problematic. Sraffa was clear that the proposition was false, but surmised that it may contain an element of truth. When he came back to the issue, in November of 1943, he clarified that his proposition was based on the statistical compensation of large numbers, and therefore called it my hypothesis, or simply hypothesis. As Sraffa saw at the beginning of the 1940s, it was precisely this hypothesis that was underlying, or that was underlying also Marx's labor-based concept of a given organic composition of capital for the system as a whole that can be ascertained independently of the distribution of the product. However, at that time, he had already convinced himself that an element of truth referred to resided neither in the statistical compensation of large numbers nor in the labor-based evaluation of social product and social capital. It was clear to him then also that no actual economic system could ever be expected to strictly satisfy the hypothesis. Hence, well, Steve, you can explain Steve Keen from that. Well, not really. Sraffa therefore explored the possibility of constructing an artificial system that did so. This artificial system had to possess all the properties of that part of the actual system out of which it was constructed, that is, the set of basic equations, and at the same time offer a straightforward expression of one of these properties, that is, the inverse relation between the actual rate of profits and the share of wages. This Sraffa accomplished in January 1944 in terms of the standard system and standard commodity in a set of notes he interestingly titled Hypothesis. The upshot of the argument developed with the help of these concepts was the establishment of a simple linear relationship between the rate of profits, small r, and proportional wages, W. So R small r equals big R, bracket 1 minus W, close bracket, where now R, big R, is the standard ratio or maximum rate of profits, and W is the share of wages, the net income of the standard system. So he's kind of, I got an equation for it. Equation 2 may be said to incorporate what is sounding in equation 1 and at the same time overcome its deficiencies, while Sraffa has started to develop his production equations in the late 1920s, assuming wages had to be paid post factum, not ante factum, by eschewing Marx's labor-based constructions. He later realized that the latter had not only recaptured the circular flow conception of social production of Petty and the physiocrats, this idea of circular flow comes back to him, and it operated with a variant of his hypothesis, and had come close to working out a correct solution. That this is, we believe, the main reason for Sraffa's appreciation of Marx's achievements. In fact, Sraffa went so far as to maintain that Marx knew all this. This interpretation is confirmed by numerous documents written in the mid-1940s and late 1950s, and others following the publication of Sraffa's 1960 book. Thus, in some notes that he drafted in 1961 for a reply to Stephen Boddington, who had reviewed his book under the nom de plume John Eaton, Sraffa stated, "If we want to follow in Marx's footsteps and pass from values to prices of production and from rate of surplus value to rate of profits, the standard system is a necessary adjunct. For that passage implies going through certain averages, and if these are calculated without weights or with the weights of the real system, a result which is only approximately numerically correct is obtained." So there's a lot of, he's got a lot of contingencies, conditions sort of in this, but, he's coming around to a certain idea that still retains that Marxist stuff. If an exact result is wanted, the proportions of the standard system of equations must be applied as weights. Now, this is not stated explicitly in the book, but is implied. Sraffa then composed a set of notes entitled Riposta a Eaton, in which he showed how the general rate of profits can be an exact weighted average of the different industries' rates of profit calculated for the different industries on the basis of the labor values of the products by using the standard system proportions as weights. This is like, like we might use data from that is subsequently used in an input-output table. In connection with this reply to Eaton, Sraffa also composed a note in which he spelt out his reading of Marx's value hypothesis, which renders his above exclamation that Marx knew all of this intelligible. He insisted, "The propositions of Marx are based on the assumption that the composition of any large aggregation of commodities, for example, wages, profits, constant capital, consists of a random selection so that the ratio between the aggregate values, that is the rate of surplus value, rate of profit, is approximately the same, whether measured at values or at the prices of production corresponding to any rate of surplus value." Now, this is obviously true, or it's a tautology in some ways, and one could leave it at that. And if it were not for the tiresome objector who relies on hypothetical deviations, it is clear that Marx's proportions are not intended to deal with such deviations. They are based on the assumption, justified in general, that the aggregates are of some average composition. Now, in order to be exactly true, the proportions would have to be those of the standard commodity. Ipso facto. In Sraffa's reading, this is indeed what Marx had in mind. To the above he added, i.e., Marx assumes that wages and profits consist approximately of values of standard commodity, and put 2 straight lines in the margin. Sraffa interprets Marx here as assuming that the properties of the actual economic system come close to those of the quote-unquote standard system, and that therefore profits and wages reflect approximately quantities of the standard commodity. So this is a further abstraction, just like we went from labor to labor power. You have these systems of abstraction that when you start using them linguistically, you get into trouble. The difference, for example, between labor and labor power. Concluding remarks. See, I got to the end. When, In 1927, at the latest, Sraffa first realized the existence of a distinctive classical approach to the theory of value distribution. He composed a note in which he praised Marx for having previously got hold of this approach again, for having reconstructed its development from Petty and Bois-Guilbert through to Torrens and Ricardo, and for exploring further its potential by divesting it of the vulgar reformulations associated with authors like J.B. Say, Nassau Sr., and John Stuart Mill. Still more terrific. In the middle of the 19th century, a man succeeds, either by accident or by superhuman effort, in getting again hold of the classical theory. He improves it and draws its practical consequences from it. That sounds just so very Italian. However, Sraffa was convinced that the right notion of cost, that of physical real cost, from which Petty and the Physiocrats had correctly started, had been corrupted by the adoption of the labor theory of value. In Sraffa's view, it was therefore necessary to jettison Marx's labor-based approach and the concepts associated with it, and to make a fresh start by combining the modern tool of systems of simultaneous equations with the classical concepts of physical real cost and the circular flow view of production. So it's Marx, it's classical political economy with Sraffian characteristics, hence the neo-Ricardian. Sraffa showed in terms of the second equation that the general rate of profits and relative prices are fully determined by the objective data from which he started. Labor value magnitudes, being themselves merely derivatives of the given physical conditions, have no role to play in this determination and are at best superfluous. So folks have seized on that, and that's kind of the whole neo-Ricardian thing. The evidence laid out, especially from the first period of Sraffa's reconstruction and interpretive work, documents his critical attitude towards the labor theory of value and his advocacy of the concept of physical real costs. However, when towards the end of the first period, Sraffa began to discuss systems with a surplus and workers' participation in the sharing out of the surplus, he convinced himself that quantities of labor had to be included in the objective data from which rates of profit and relative prices were to be determined. In the second period of his constructive work, which extended mainly from 1942 to 46, Sraffa then explored systematically the relationship of his own concepts and findings with those of Marx. He found that Marx had spotted a serious flaw in Ricardo's fundamental proposition concerning income distribution. In some parts of his analysis, Ricardo had, for simplicity, taken social capital to consist only of wages, or to be reducible to wages in a finite number of steps. This raises an entire issue about social capital that is also about social ontology. And so he had overlooked that with a circular flow concept of production. The rate of profits depends not only on proportional wages, that is, the share of wages, but also on the technical conditions of production. So we're right back to Marx again. Sraffa credited Marx with having recaptured the circular flow aspect of social production, Volume 2, with having discovered that in these conditions, the maximum rate of profits is finite, see above, and with having specified its magnitude as the inverse of the organic composition of capital, the OCC, as a whole. The latter was seen to be independent of income distribution, which is a key problem, and the Japanese spent time on this. The idea of the ratio of the value or the social product to the social capital to be invariant to changes in income distribution had been invoked by Sraffa as early as 1931. This invariance condition, Sraffa soon realized, was not satisfied by any actual system, but could be generated by using a special construction. This was the device of the standard system elaborated by Sraffa in January 1943. Now, yes, this is a lot of arm waving, but it does give you the foundation for what finally happens in the actual published 1960, production of commodities by means of commodities. And yes, I got to the end. You may not understand it as well, but I've added some videos that might make it work. I added an article, the article or parts of the article, Sraffa After Marx, an open issue by Riccardo Bellafiore. It's a very good article, and I will not read it, of course. Instead of a conclusion, it's conjectural history. It's actually kind of interesting where he gets to by the end. And then provide a, this may be more complicated, but there is the Sraffa archive is online. And yes, you have to brush up on your Italian, but uh, Trinity College, Cambridge has been good enough to do that, to digitize the entire thing, because that's where Sraffa spent all his time. And then I've included a fairly recent little panel on the political economy of Sraffa, including the author of the PowerPoint slides at the front end, Scott Carter. So, and this is organized to occur, or was organized to occur, at the University of Tulsa. So that has a whole other, context for why they were doing it. And then I included Kurtz's Piero Sraffa and Counterfactuals. And, this is a result of looking at the unpublished papers in the 1920s. And so there's lots of stuff. And then I included a little thing that just the abstract from several different papers that you may find interesting, you may get confused. There are other issues like the theory of gravitation, center of gravitation proposed by this middle article. But anyway, needless to say, interesting. I don't know if it's useful. So let me thank you for your attention. And I will, let's see if there were any interventions. No, there weren't, just announcements. So I will um, stop the share.